Today, China officially stated that Vladimir Putin angered Xi Jinping with his uncooperative behavior. Chinese officials suspect that Vladimir Putin made some kind of deal with Donald Trump. Venezuela in exchange for Ukraine in terms of dividing spheres of influence. The Kremlin's refusal to support Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, with whom Vladimir Putin signed a treaty on strategic and military technical cooperation, caused irritation in China and made strategists in Beijing reconsider the prospects of partnership with Moscow. The Times reports this, citing informed Chinese sources, but that's not the only reason. Let me remind you, Chinese diplomats met with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro just a few hours before he was captured by the Americans. The Chinese Foreign Ministry head called Maduro hours before the capture, assuring him, "If anything happens, we'll support you. Don't worry, we're on your side." So, it turned out that by that time, the Russians had already evacuated their diplomats from Caracas. But for some reason, they didn't warn the Chinese, their good partners and allies. But now Russia is even more forced, as they say, to bend to Beijing and apologize economically. China has sharply increased its imports of Russian Urals oil to record levels. Russian propaganda now claims this is a fantastic partnership and great news. But it turned out that China is simply buying up, at huge discounts, the oil that India refused, and Beijing is just taking the oil at cost price, oil that no one else on the market needs anymore. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give a like and write any comment under this episode, and also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. It's in this video's description. And if by the end of the episode you find it interesting and useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. I would be grateful. So, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping got angry at the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin because of Venezuela, as reported by The Times, citing an informed Chinese source. The Kremlin's refusal to support Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, with whom Putin signed a treaty on strategic and military technical cooperation, caused irritation in China. They began to question whether maintaining such close ties with Moscow was worthwhile. And, getting a little ahead of ourselves, Beijing has already officially stated for the first time that maybe it's time for Russia to end the war against Ukraine. Because besides economic benefits, there are also major downsides for China and basically all the advantages that China could squeeze out of Russia. It already squeezed them dry, there's nothing left. According to the publication's source, Russian authorities did not share their assessment of the situation in Venezuela or their decision to withdraw more diplomats and families from Caracas in December with the Chinese. As a result, China was caught off guard. A United States Special Forces operation resulted in Nicolas Maduro being captured and taken to the United States, where he faces a life sentence on charges of organizing drug trafficking. Just a few hours before his arrest, Nicolas Maduro met with Xu Xiaoti in Caracas. This is China's envoy to Latin America. And at the same time, after this meeting, the head of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spoke on the phone with his Venezuelan counterpart. He promised him, as stated on the Foreign Ministry's website, quote, firm support in defending the country's sovereignty and stability. A few hours later, Maduro is captured, making the Americans and Chinese look foolish. All this caused irritation in Beijing and sparked heated discussions about the relationship between China and Russia. And in some circles, there was even speculation that the silence of the Russian air defense systems in Venezuela during the American raid was not a coincidence, but a sign of cooperation between Moscow and Washington. How did the Russians know to evacuate diplomats and their families? Just a few days before the American operation, Xi Jinping began to suspect that Putin might already be working for the enemy. Well, no matter how it sounds, the United States operation demonstrated the limited real capabilities of Beijing, despite their loud diplomatic statements. And there's no need to remind what losing face means in Chinese culture. And the Chinese were truly embarrassed by these meetings between their officials and Nicolas Maduro just a few hours before the Venezuelan president was captured by the Americans. And in Chinese culture, this is a humiliation below the belt. That's why in China, there are increasingly louder discussions that cooperation with Russia brings more harm than benefit. It turns out that Beijing is tied to a partner whose actions contradict its own ideas of order, predictability, and control, undermining the carefully cultivated image it has built. Such a stabilizing force on the world stage, advocating for adherence to international rules. In other words, Xi Jinping is constantly trying to present himself in this way. And next, I'll quote the Times. Although Russia's isolation due to the war against Ukraine has brought economic benefits to China, the costs of the two countries growing closer are also obvious, noted Professor Jia Jingguo, former dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University and one of China's most influential strategists, in an interview shortly before the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Among such costs, he mentioned the deterioration of China's current and future relations with Europe, adding that resolving the conflict in Ukraine would be beneficial for China. Due to the overthrow of Maduro, China may also suffer significant economic losses. China provided Venezuela with billion-dollar loans, and since Venezuela couldn't pay them back, it began to partially repay these loans with oil. However, after the dictator Maduro seized power on January 3rd, not a single oil tanker left Venezuela for China. Washington announced that it would control the oil exports of the South American country, and now tankers with its oil are only going to the United States. And here I should note that in the second half of 2025, China was receiving about $440,000 worth of Venezuelan oil daily, which is about 4% of its total imports. But that's a big number. Beijing was so confident in the Nicolas Maduro regime that just last year it invested about $10 billion in the construction of a petrochemical complex in Xi'an. This is Guangdong province, which is designed specifically for processing heavy Venezuelan oil, so it will be difficult to repurpose this plant. It's possible, but difficult. And now China has started making Moscow pay for this kind of setup with Venezuela. China has sharply increased its imports of Russian Urals oil, which Indian refineries have started to reject due to sanctions. And don't jump to conclusions here, because Russian propaganda is shouting, look, China has started buying more Russian oil, this is a victory, and so on. But what actually happened? In a month, seaborne deliveries of Russian oil to China exceeded 1.5 million barrels per day, which is 300,000 more than the average last year, when Venezuelan oil was going to China. At the same time, shipments of Urals oil, which India used to buy, have tripled to 260,000 barrels per day. In the fourth quarter, in January of this year, imports of Urals increased by another 70%, reaching 447,000 barrels per day. This is the highest level since April 2023. But the thing is, China demanded record discounts on Russian oil since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. He says, of course, we're ready to buy all this oil that you wanted to sell to India. But listen, we're not going to buy it at market price. And now, listen closely. In Russian ports, the discount on Urals oil reaches $26 to $28 per barrel, and in Chinese ports, it's another $10 on top of that. Just so you understand, these kinds of discounts make selling oil unprofitable, and China is absolutely fine with this arrangement. He says, listen, give us a discount, let's say on average $37, a $37 discount per barrel, that's just unheard of. Considering that Brent crude oil is currently $64 per barrel, you subtract 37 and get the price at which China buys Russian oil. As for the major Indian refineries, they have hardly processed any Russian oil since December at their facilities, whose products are intended for export to the European Union. This has reduced Urals imports to India by around 500,000 barrels per day. Now these barrels with huge discounts are going to China, but just think about it again. The total discount that China is getting averages $37. Nevertheless, Russian oil producers cannot redirect all the oil that was intended for India to China. As Bloomberg writes, due to difficulties in selling oil, Russian oil companies have started to cut production, even though the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus quota actually allows them to increase it. But let's get back to the suspicions from the Chinese side. Suspicions are also growing in Beijing that Moscow might have reached an agreement with the current administration in Washington behind Beijing's back, about a kind of exchange of Venezuela for Ukraine, or more precisely, about dividing spheres of influence behind Beijing's back, after the American raid. Many media outlets recalled the 2019 testimony in Congress by Fiona Hill, who was responsible for Russia in the White House during Trump's first term. Hill said at the time that Russian officials had repeatedly made, quote, a very strange exchange proposal, according to which Moscow could reduce its support for Nicolas Maduro if the United States gave it more freedom of action in Ukraine. It wasn't an official proposal, but rather a hint, a nudge, a wink, a suggestion to make a deal, Hill noted. According to her, in April of the same year, she went to Moscow to make it clear to the Kremlin that the issues of Ukraine and Venezuela are in no way connected to each other. Nevertheless, suspicions have arisen in China, and now Putin appears to Beijing as either a traitor, a donor, or a defector. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel. I would really appreciate it. You can do this by donating through the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.